reading you chapter 1 of Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, just for the purposes of the hashtag #NeverReadsReadAlong. And thanks again to Neil for giving permission for people to read this, and we'll be taking these videos down at the end of the read along, so enjoy now, they'll be going soon. Chapter 1. She'd been running for 4 days now, a harum-scarum tumbling flight through passages and tunnels. She was hungry and exhausted and more tired than a body could stand, and each successive door was proving harder to open. After 4 days of flight, she'd found a hiding place, a tiny stone burrow under the world where she would be safe, or at least so she prayed. And at last she slept. Mr. Croup had hired Ross at the last floating market, which had been held in Westminster Abbey. "Think of him," he told Mr. Vandermeer, "as a canary." "Sings?" asked Mr. Vandermeer. "I doubt it. I sincerely and utterly doubt it." Mr. Croup ran a hand through his lank orange hair. "No, my fine friend, I was thinking metaphorically, more along the lines of the birds that they take down mines." Mr. Vandermeer nodded, comprehension dawning slowly. "Yes, a canary." Mr. Ross had no other resemblance to a canary. He was huge, almost as big as Mr. Vandermeer, and extremely grubby and quite hairless, and he said very little, though he made a point of telling each of them that he liked to kill things and he was good at it, and this amused Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandermeer, much as Genghis Khan might have been amused by the swagger of a young Mongol who had recently pillaged his first village or burnt his first yurt. He was a canary, and he never knew it. So Mr. Ross went first in his filthy T-shirt and his crusted blue jeans, and Croup and Vandermeer walked behind him in their elegant black suits. There are 4 simple ways for the observant to tell Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandermeer apart. First, Mr. Vandermeer is 2.5 heads taller than Mr. Croup. Second, Mr. Croup has eyes of a faded china blue, while Mr. Vandermeer's eyes are brown. Third, while Mr. Vandermeer fashioned the rings he wears on his right hand out of the skulls of 4 ravens, Mr. Croup has no obvious jewellery. Fourth, Mr. Croup likes words, while Mr. Vandermeer is always hungry. Also, they look nothing alike. A rustle in the tunnel darkness. Mr. Vandermeer's knife was in his hand, and then it was no longer in his hand, and it was quivering gently, almost 30 feet away. He walked over to his knife, picked it up by the hilt. There was a grey rat impaled on the blade, its mouth opening and closing impotently as the life fled. He crushed its skull between finger and thumb. "Now there's one rat that won't be telling any more tales," said Mr. Croup. He chuckled at his own joke. Mr. Vandermeer did not respond. Rat, tales, get it? Mr. Vandermeer pulled the rat from the blade and began to munch on it thoughtfully, head first. Mr. Croup slapped it out of his hands. "Stop that," he said. Mr. Vandermeer put his knife away a little sullenly. "Buck up," hissed Mr. Croup encouragingly. "There will always be another rat. Now onward. Things to do. People to damage." 3 years in London had not changed Richard, although it had changed the way he perceived the city. Richard had originally imagined London as a grey city, even as a black city from the pictures he'd seen. He was surprised to find it filled with colour. It was a city of red brick and white stone, of red buses and large black taxis, which were often, to Richard's initial puzzlement, gold or green or maroon. It was a city in which the very old and the awkwardly new jostled each other, not uncomfortably, but without respect. A city of shops and offices and restaurants and homes, of parks and churches, of ignored monuments and remarkably unpalatial palaces. A city of hundreds of districts with strange names: Crouch End, Chalk Farm, Earl's Court, Marble Arch, and oddly distinct identities. A noisy, dirty, cheerful, troubled city which fed on tourists, needed them as it despised them, in which the average speed of transportation through the city had not increased in 300 years following 500 years of fitful road widening and unskilful compromises between the needs of traffic, whether horse-drawn or more recently motorised, and the needs of pedestrians. A city inhabited by and teeming with people of every colour and manner and kind. When he had first arrived, he'd found London to be huge, odd, fundamentally incomprehensible, with only the tube map, that elegant multicoloured topographical display of underground railway lines and stations, giving it any semblance of order. Gradually he realised the tube map was a handy fiction that made life easier but bore no resemblance to the reality of the shape of the city above, like belonging to a political party, he thought once, proudly. And then, having tried to explain the resemblance between the tube map and politics at a party to a cluster of bewildered strangers, he decided in the future to leave political comment to others. He continued slowly, by a process of osmosis and white knowledge, which is like white noise, only more informative, to comprehend the city. A process which accelerated when he realised that the actual city of London itself was no bigger than a square mile, stretching from Aldgate in the east to Fleet Street, and the law courts of the Old Bailey in the west, a tiny municipality, now home to London's financial institutions, and that was where it had all began. 2,000 years before, London had been a little Celtic village on the north shore of the Thames, which the Romans had encountered and settled in. London had grown slowly until roughly 1,000 years later it met the tiny city of Westminster immediately to the west. Once London Bridge had been built, London met the town of Southwark directly across the river, and it continued to grow, fields and woods and marshland slowly vanishing beneath the flourishing town, and it continued to expand, encountering other little villages and hamlets as it grew, like Whitechapel and Deptford to the east, and Hammersmith and Shepherd's Bush to the west, and Camden and Islington in the north, Battersea and Lambeth across the Thames to the south, absorbing all of them as it grew, just as a pool of mercury encounters and incorporates smaller beads of mercury, leaving only their names behind. London grew into something huge and contradictory. It was a good place and a fine city, but there is a price to be paid for all good places, and a price that all good places have to pay. After a while, Richard found himself taking London for granted. In time, he began to pride himself on having visited none of the sights of London, except for the Tower of London, when his Aunt Maud came down to the city for a weekend and Richard found himself her reluctant escort. But Jessica changed all that. Richard found himself on 2 otherwise sensible weekends, accompanying her to places like the National Gallery and the Tate Gallery, where he learned that walking around museums too long hurts your feet, that the great art treasures of the world all blur into each other after a while, and that it is almost beyond the human capacity for belief to accept how much museum cafeterias will brazenly charge for a slice of cake and a cup of tea. "Here's your tea and your eclair," he told her. "It would have cost less to buy one of those Tintorettos." "Don't exaggerate," said Jessica cheerfully. "Anyway, there aren't any Tintorettos at the Tate." "I should have had that cherry cake," said Richard. "Then they'd have been able to afford another Van Gogh." "No," said Jessica accurately, "they wouldn't." Jessica had met Richard in France, on a weekend break in Paris 2 years earlier. He had in fact discovered her in the Louvre, while trying to find the group of his office friends who'd organised the trip. Staring up at an immense sculpture, he'd stepped backwards into Jessica, who was admiring an extremely large and historically important diamond. He tried to apologise to her in French, which he did not speak, and then he gave up and he tried to apologise in English, and then tried to attempt to apologise in French for his having to apologise in English, until he noticed that Jessica was about as English as it was possible for any one person to be, by which time she had him buy her an expensive French sandwich and some overpriced fizzy apple juice by way of an apology. And, well, that was the start of it all, really. He'd never been able to convince Jessica that he wasn't the sort of person who went to art galleries after that. On weekends that they did not go to art galleries or to museums, Richard would trail behind Jessica as she went shopping, which she did, on the whole, in Knightsbridge, a short walk and an even shorter taxi ride from her flat in a Kensington mews. Richard would accompany Jessica on her tours of such huge and intimidating emporia as Harrods and Harvey Nichols, department stores where Jessica was able to purchase anything from jewellery to books to the week's groceries. Richard had been awed by Jessica, who was beautiful and often quite funny, was certainly going somewhere, and Jessica saw in Richard an enormous amount of potential, which, properly harnessed by the right woman, would have made him the perfect matrimonial accessory. If only he were a little more focused, she would murmur to herself. So she gave him books with titles like Dress for Success and 125 Habits of Successful Men, and books on how to run a business like a military campaign, and Richard always thanked you, and he always meant to read them. In Harvey Nichols' men's fashion department, she'd pick out for him the kinds of clothes that she thought he should wear, and he wore them, during the week anyway. And a year to the day after their first encounter, she told him she thought it was time that they went shopping for an engagement ring. "Why do you go out with her?" asked Carrie in corporate accounts 18 months after that. "She's terrifying." Richard shook his head. "She's really sweet, once you get to know her." Gary put down the plastic troll that he'd picked up from Richard's desk. "I'm sorry she still lets you play with all these." "The subject has never come up," said Richard, picking up one of the creatures from his desk. It had a shock of day-glow orange hair and a slightly baffled expression, as if it were lost. The subject had indeed come up. Jessica had, however, convinced herself that Richard's troll collection was a mark of endearing eccentricity, comparable to Mr. Stockton's collection of angels. Jessica was in the process of organising a travelling exhibition of Mr. Stockton's angel collection, and had come to the conclusion that great men always collected something. In actuality, Richard did not really collect trolls. He'd found a troll on the street outside the office, and in a vague and pretty vain attempt at injecting a little personality into his working world, he'd placed it on his computer monitor. The others had followed over the next few months, gifts from colleagues who'd noticed that Richard had a penchant for the ugly little creatures. He'd taken the gifts and positioned them strategically about his desk, beside the telephones and the framed photograph of Jessica. Today the photograph had a yellow post-it note stuck to it. It was Friday afternoon. Richard had noticed that events were cowards. They didn't occur singly, but instead they would run in packs and leap out at him all at once. Take this particular Friday, for example. It was, as Jessica had pointed out to him at least a dozen times in the last month, the most important day of his life. Not the most important day of her life, of course. That would come one day in the future, when Richard had no doubt they'd make her Prime Minister or Queen or God. But it was, without question, the most important day of his life, so it was unfortunate that, despite the post-it note Richard had left on his fridge door at home, and the other post-it note he'd put on the photograph of Jessica on his desk, he had forgotten about it completely and utterly. Also, there was the Wandsworth report, which was overdue and taking up most of his head. Richard checked another row of figures. Then he noticed that page 17 had vanished. He set it up to print out again. And another page down, and he knew that if only he were left alone to finish it, if, miracle of miracles, the phone did not ring. It rang. He thumbed the speakerphone. "Hello, Richard. The managing director needs to know when he'll have the report." Richard looked at his watch. 5 minutes, Sylvia. It's almost wrapped up. I just have to attach the P&L projection. Thanks, Dick. I'll come down for it. Sylvia was, as she liked to explain, the MD's PA, and she moved in an atmosphere of crisp efficiency. He thumbed the speakerphone off. It rang again, immediately. "Richard," said the speaker, with Jessica's voice. "It's Jessica. You haven't forgotten, have you?" Forgotten? He tried to remember what he could have forgotten. He looked at Jessica's photograph for inspiration, and he found all the inspiration he could have needed in the shape of a yellow post-it note stuck to her forehead. "Richard, pick up the telephone." He picked up the phone, reading the post-it note as he did so. "Sorry, Jess. No, I hadn't forgotten. 7 p.m. at Ma Maison Italiano. Should I meet you there?" "Jessica, Richard. Jessica, not Jess." She paused for a moment. "After what happened last time, I don't think so. You really could get lost in your own back garden, Richard." Richard contemplated pointing out that anyone could have confused the National Gallery with the National Portrait Gallery, and it wasn't she who'd spent the whole day standing in the rain, which was, in his opinion, every bit as much fun as walking around either place until his feet hurt. But he thought better of it. "I'll meet you at your place," said Jessica. "We can walk down together." "Right, Jessica. Sorry." "You have confirmed our reservation, haven't you, Richard?" "Yes," lied Richard earnestly. The other phone on his desk had begun to ring, shrilly. "Jessica, look, Good," said Jessica, and she broke the connection. The largest amount of money that Richard had ever spent on anything had been spent on Jessica's engagement ring 18 months earlier at one of Harrod's many jewellery concessions. He picked up the other phone. "Hi, Dick," said Gary. "It's me, Gary." Gary sat a few desks down from Richard. He waved at Richard from his own gleaming, troll-free desk. "We still on for drinks? You said we could go over the Merstham account." "Get off the bloody phone, Gary. Of course we are." Richard put down the phone. There was a phone number at the bottom of the post-it note. Richard had written a post-it note to himself several weeks earlier, and he had made the reservation. He was almost certain of that. But he had not confirmed it. He'd kept meaning to, but there'd been so much to do, and Richard had known there was plenty of time, but events run in packs. Sylvia was standing next to him. "Dick, the Wandsworth report. Almost ready. Sylvia, look, hang on a sec, can you?" He finished punching in the number, breathed a sigh of relief when somebody answered. "Ma maison? Can I help you?" "Yes," said Richard. "A table for 3 for tonight. I think I booked it. If I did, I'm confirming the reservation. If I didn't, I wonder if I could book it, please." No. They had no record of a table for tonight in the name of Mayhew, or Stockton, or Bartram, that's Jessica's surname. And as for booking a table, it wasn't the words Richard found so unpleasant. It was the tone of voice in which the information was transmitted. A table for tonight should certainly have been booked years before. Perhaps, it was implied, by Richard's parents. A table for tonight was impossible. If the Pope, the Prime Minister and the President of France arrived this evening without a confirmed reservation, even they would be turned out into the street with a continental jeer. "But it's for my fiancé's boss. I know I should have phoned before. There are only 3 of us. Can you please?" They'd put down the phone. "Richard," said Sylvia, "the MD's waiting." "Do you think," asked Richard, "they'd give me a table if I phoned back and offered them extra money?" In her dream, they were all together in the house, her parents, her brother, her baby sister. They were standing together in the ballroom, staring at her. They were all so pale, so grave. Portia, her mother, touched her cheek, told her she was in danger. In her dream, Dor laughed and said she knew. Her mother shook her head. No, now she was in danger, now. Dor opened her eyes. The door was opening quietly. Quietly she held her breath. Footsteps, quiet on the stone. "Perhaps he won't notice me," she thought. "Perhaps he'll go away." And then she thought desperately, "I'm hungry." The footsteps hesitated. She was well hidden, she knew, under a pile of newspapers and rags. And was it possible that the intruder meant no harm? "Can't he hear my heartbeat?" she thought. And then the footsteps came closer. She knew what she had to do, and it scared her. A hand pulled the covers off her, and she looked up into a blank, utterly hairless face, which creased into a vicious smile. She rolled and then twisted, and the knife blade, aimed at her chest, caught her in the upper arm. Up until that moment, she'd never thought that she could do it, never thought she would be brave enough, or scared enough, or desperate enough to dare. But she reached up one hand to his chest, and she opened. He gasped and tumbled onto her. It was wet and warm and slippery, and she slithered and staggered out from under the man, and she stumbled out of the room. She caught her breath. In the tunnel outside, narrow and low as she fell against the wall, breathing in gasps and sobs. They had taken the last of her strength, and now she was spent. Her shoulder was beginning to throb. The knife, she thought. But she was safe. "Oh my," said a voice from the darkness on her right. "She survived, Mr. Ross." "Well, I never, Mr. Vandermeer." The voice oozed. It sounded like grey slime. "Well, I never, Mr. Croup," said a flat voice on her left. A light was kindled and flickered. "Still," said Mr. Croup, his eyes gleaming in the dark beneath the earth, "she won't survive us." Dor kneed him hard in the groin, and then she began, randomly, to run, her right hand holding her left shoulder. And she ran. "Dick?" Richard waved away the interruption. Life was almost under his control now. Just a little more time. Gary said his name again. "Dick, it's 6:30. "It's what?" Papers and pens and spreadsheets and trolls were tumbled into Richard's briefcase. He snapped it shut. He ran. He pulled his coat on, and as he went, Gary was following. "Are we going to have that drink, then?" "Drink? We were meant to be getting together this evening to talk about a Merstham account, remember?" "Was that tonight?" Richard paused for a moment. He decided, if ever they made disorganisation an Olympic event, he could be disorganised for Britain. "Gary," he said, I'm sorry I blew it. I have to see Jessica tonight. We're taking her boss out to dinner." "Mr. Stockton? Of Stockton's? The Stockton?" Richard nodded. They hurried down the stairs. "I'm sure you'll have fun," said Gary insincerely. "How is the creature from the Black Lagoon?" "Jessica's from Ilford, actually, Gary, and she remains the light and love of my life. Thank you very much for asking." By which time they were in the lobby, and Richard made a dart for the automatic doors, which spectacularly failed to open. "It's after 6, Mr. Mayhew," said Mr. Figgis, the building security guard. "You'll have to sign out." "I don't need this," said Richard, to no one in particular. "I really don't." Mr. Figgis smelt vaguely of medicinal liniment and was widely rumoured to have an encyclopedic collection of softcore pornography. He guarded the doors with a diligence that bordered upon madness, never quite having lived down the evening when an entire floor's worth of computer equipment was upped and left, along with 2 potted palms and the managing director's Axminster carpet. "So our drink's off, then. I'm sorry, Gary. Is Monday okay for you?" "Sure, Monday's fine. See you Monday." Mr. Figgis inspected their signatures, satisfied himself that they had no computers, potted palms, or carpets about their persons. Then he pressed a button under his desk. The doors slid open. "Doors," said Richard. The underway branched and divided. She picked her way at random, ducking through tunnels, running, stumbling and weaving. Behind her strolled Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandermeer as calmly and cheerfully as Victorian dignitaries visiting the Crystal Palace exhibition. When they arrived at a crossroads, Mr. Croup would kneel and find the nearest spot of blood, and then they would follow it. They were like hyenas exhausting their prey. They could wait. They had all the time in the world. Luck was with Richard for a change. He caught a black taxi driven by a particularly enthusiastic taxi driver who took Richard home by an unlikely route involving streets Richard had never previously noticed. Whilst holding forth, as Richard had discovered all London taxi drivers will hold forth, given a living, breathing, English-speaking passenger, on London's inner-city traffic problems, how best to deal with crime, thorny political issues of the day. Richard jumped out of the cab, leaving a tip and his briefcase behind. Managed to flag down the cab again before it made it into the main road, got his briefcase back, then went up the stairs and into his flat. He was already shedding clothes as he entered the hall. His briefcase spun across the room and crash-landed on the sofa. He took his keys from his pocket, placed them carefully on the hall table in order to ensure that he did not forget them. Then he dashed into the bedroom. The buzzer sounded. Richard, 3/4 of the way into his best suit, launched himself at the entry phone. "Richard, it's Jessica. I hope you're ready." "Oh, yeah, be right down." He pulled on a coat and he ran, slamming the door behind him. Jessica was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs. She always waited for him there. Jessica didn't like Richard's flat. It made her feel uncomfortably female. There's always the chance of finding a piece of Richard's underwear. Well, anywhere. Not to mention the wandering lumps of congealed toothpaste on the bathroom sink. No, it was not a Jessica kind of a place. Jessica was very beautiful. So much so that Richard would occasionally find himself staring at her, wondering, how did she end up with me? And when they made love, which they did at Jessica's Mews flat in fashionable Kensington, in Jessica's brass bed with the crisp white linen sheets, for Jessica's parents had told her that duvets were decadent, in the darkness, afterwards she would hold him very tightly, and her long brown curls would tumble over his chest, and she would whisper to him how much she loved him, and he would tell her that he loved her, and always wanted to be with her, and they both believed it to be true. "Bless me, Mr. Vandermeer, she's slowing up." "Slowing up, Mr. Croup." "She must be losing a lot of blood, Mr. V." "Lovely blood, Mr. C. Lovely wet blood." "Not long now." A click. The sound of a flick knife opening. Empty, lonely, and dark. "Richard, what are you doing?" asked Jessica. Nothing, Jessica. Oh, you haven't forgotten your keys again, have you? No, Jessica. Richard stopped him, patting himself, pushed his hands deep into the pockets of his coat. Now, when you meet Mr. Stockton tonight, said Jessica, you have to appreciate that he's not just a very important man. He's also a corporate entity in his own right. I can't wait, sighed Richard. What was that, Richard? I can't wait, said Richard, rather more enthusiastically. Oh, do step lively, said Jessica, who was beginning to exude an aura of what, in a lesser woman, might almost have been described as nerves. We mustn't keep Mr. Stockton waiting. No, Jess. Don't call me that, Richard. I loathe pet names. They're so demeaning. Spare any change? The man sat in a doorway. His beard was yellow and grey. His eyes were sunken and dark. A hand-lettered sign hung from a piece of frayed string around his neck and rested on his chest, telling anyone with the eyes to read it that he was homeless and hungry. It didn't take a sign to tell you that. Richard, hand already in his pocket, fumbled for a coin. Richard, we haven't got the time, said Jessica, who gave to charity and invested ethically. Now, I do want you to make a good impression, fiancé-wise. It is vital that a future spouse makes a good impression. Then her face creased and she hugged him for a moment and said, Oh, Richard, I do love you. You do know that, don't you? And Richard nodded and did. Jessica checked her watch and increased her pace. Richard discreetly flicked a pound coin back through the air towards the man in the doorway, who caught it in a grimy hand. There wasn't any problem with the reservations, was there? Asked Jessica. And Richard, who was not much good at lying when faced with a direct question, said, She had chosen wrongly. The corridor ended in a blank wall. Normally that would hardly have given her pause, but she was so tired and so hungry and in so much pain, she leaned towards the wall, feeling the brick roughness against her face. She was gulping breath, hiccuping and sobbing. Her arm was cold, her left hand was numb. She could go no further, and the world was beginning to feel very distant. She wanted to stop, to lie down, to sleep for 100 years. Oh, bless my little black soul, Mr. Vandermeer. Do you see what I see? The voice was soft, close. They must have been nearer to her than she had imagined. I spy, with my little eye, something that's going to be dead in a minute, Mr. Croup, said the flat voice from above her. Our principal will be delighted. And the girl pulled whatever she could find deep inside her soul from all the pain and the hurt and the fear. She was spent, burnt out and entirely exhausted. She had nowhere to go, no power left, no time. If it's the last door I open, she prayed silently to the temple, to the arch. Somewhere, anywhere, safe. And then she thought wildly, somebody. And as she began to pass out, she tried to open a door. And as the darkness took her, she heard Mr. Croup's voice, as if from a long way. It said, Bugger and blast. Jessica and Richard walked down the street towards the restaurant. She had her arm through his and was walking as fast as her heels permitted. He hurried to keep up. Street lights and the fronts of closed doors illuminated their path. They passed a stretch of tall, looming buildings, abandoned and lonely, bounded by a high brick wall. You're honestly telling me you had to promise them an extra £50 for our table tonight? You are an idiot, Richard. Jessica, dark eyes flashing, was not even slightly amused. They'd lost my reservation, and they said all the tables were booked. Their steps echoed off the high walls. They'll probably have us sitting by the kitchen, sighed Jessica, or the door. Did you tell them it was for Mr. Stockton? Yes, replied Richard. Jessica sighed again. She continued to drag him along as a door opened in the wall a little way ahead of them, and someone stepped out and stood swaying for one long, terrible moment, and then collapsed to the concrete. Richard shivered, stopped in his tracks. Jessica tugged him into motion. Now, when you're talking to Mr. Stockton, you must make sure you don't interrupt him or disagree with him. He doesn't like to be disagreed with. When he makes a joke, laugh. If you're in any doubt as whether or not he's made a joke, look at me. I'll tap my forefinger. They'd reached the person on the pavement. Jessica stepped over the crumpled form. Richard hesitated. Jessica? You're right. He might think I'm bored, she mused. I know, she said brightly. If he makes a joke, I'll rub my earlobe. Jessica! He could not believe that she was simply ignoring the figure at their feet. What? She was not pleased to be jerked out of her reverie. Look! He pointed at the pavement. The person was face down and enveloped in bulky clothes. Jessica took his arm and tugged him towards her. "Oh, I see. If you pay them any attention, Richard, they'll walk all over you. They all have homes, really. Once she's slept it off, I'm sure she'll be fine." "She?" Richard looked down. It was a girl. Jessica continued. "Now, I've told Mr. Stockton that Richard was down on one knee. Richard, what are you doing?" "She isn't drunk," said Richard. "She's hurt." He looked at his fingertips. She's bleeding." Jessica looked down at him, nervous and puzzled. "We're going to be late," she pointed out. "She's hurt." Jessica looked back at the girl on the pavement. Priorities. Richard had no priorities. "Richard, we're going to be late. Someone else will be along. Someone else can help her." The girl's face was crusted with dirt, and her clothes were wet with blood. "She's hurt," he said simply. There was an expression on his face that Jessica hadn't seen before. "Richard," she warned, and then she relented a little and she offered a compromise. "Dial 99 and call an ambulance then, but quickly now." Suddenly the girl's eyes opened, white and wide, in a face that was little more than a smudge of dust and blood. "Not a hospital, please. They'll find me. Take me somewhere safe, please." Her voice was weak. "You're bleeding," said Richard. He longed to see where she'd come from, but the wall was blank and brick and unbroken. He looked back to her still form and asked, "Why not a hospital? Help me," the girl whispered, and her eyes closed. Again he asked her, "Why don't you want to go to the hospital?" This time there was no answer at all. "When you call the ambulance," said Jessica, "don't give your name, because then you'll have to give a statement or something, and then we'd be late, and I'm not having this evening ruined by—" "Richard, what are you doing?" Richard had picked the girl up, cradling her in his arms. She was surprisingly light. "I'm taking her back to my place, Jess. I can't leave her. Tell Mr. Stockton I'm really sorry, but it was an emergency. I'm sure he'll understand." "Richard Oliver Mayhew," said Jessica coldly, "you put that young person down and you come here this minute, or this engagement is at an end as of now. I'm warning you." Richard felt the sticky warmth of blood soaking into his shirt. Sometimes, he realised, there is nothing you can do. He walked away. Jessica stood there on the pavement watching him ruin her big evening, her eyes stung with tears. After a while he was out of sight, and then, and only then, did she say, loudly and distinctly, an unladylike "shit," and fling her handbag as hard as she could onto the ground, hard enough to scatter her mobile phone and her lipstick and her diary and a handful of tampons across the concrete. And then, because there was nothing else to do, she picked them all up and put them back in her handbag and walked down to the restaurant to wait for Mr. Stockton. Later, as she sipped on her white wine, she tried to come up with plausible explanations why her fiancé was not with her. She found herself wondering desperately whether or not she could simply claim that Richard was dead. "It was very sudden," said Jessica, wistfully, under her breath. Richard did not, at any point on his walk, stop to think. It was not something over which he had any volition. Somewhere in the sensible part of his head, someone, a normal, sensible Richard Mayhew, was telling him how ridiculous he was being, that he should have just called the police or an ambulance, that it was dangerous to lift an injured person, that he had really seriously, properly upset Jessica, that he was going to have to sleep on the sofa tonight, that he was spoiling his only one really good suit, that the girl smelled quite dreadful. But Richard found himself placing one foot in front of the other, and arms cramping back, hurting, and ignoring the looks he got from passers-by. He just kept walking. After a while he was at the ground floor door of his building, and he was stumbling up the staircase, and then he was standing in front of the door to his flat and realising that he had left his keys on the small hall table inside. The girl reached out one filthy hand to the door, and it swung open. "Never thought I'd be pleased that that door hadn't latched properly," thought Richard, and he carried the girl in, closing the door behind him with his foot, and he put her down on his bed. His shirt front was soaked in blood. She seemed semi-conscious. Her eyes were closed, but fluttering. He peeled off her leather jacket. There was a long cut on her left upper arm and shoulder. Richard caught his breath. "Look, I'm going to call a doctor," he said quietly. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened wide and scared. "Please, no. No, it'll be fine. It's not as bad as it looks. I just need sleep. No doctors." "But your arm, your shoulder, I'll be fine. Tomorrow. Please." It was little more than a whisper. I suppose. All right." With sanity beginning to assert itself, he said, "Look, can I ask—" But she was asleep. Richard took an old school scarf from his closet. He wrapped it firmly around her left upper arm and shoulder. He did not want her to bleed to death on his bed before he could get her to a doctor. Then he tiptoed out of the bedroom and he shut the door behind him. He sat down on the sofa in front of the television and he wondered what he had done. That is the end of chapter 1. I will, of course, read you chapter 2 sometime, but I won't read it now. So have a good evening. See you soon. Bye.